Good morning. Last week, if you remember, I suggested that no one come near me, and it looked like, because I wasn't sure if I was sick or not, it turned out that by Sunday afternoon, I found out that was a very good call. Ended up fairly sick this week, and about 2 days ago, I think I'm no longer sick. Unfortunately, I still have a lot of the holdovers from it, including the respiratory things in the throat, so I want to again thank the manufacturers of chloroseptic cough drops for making this message possible. And unfortunately, as of yesterday, Linda is now sick. So anyway, I have sympathy for any of you who end up with this flu. It's not a fun one to have. We're going to deal with something today, excuse me. If I pause a couple of times to take a cough drop, I apologize. We're going to deal with something today that we often don't deal with in churches. What we're going to deal with is the first part, and we're going to have several weeks actually to deal with this. We're going to talk about how to deal with death and how to deal with depression. Because a lot of times when we come to churches, we talk about either happy stuff or we talk about theology or we talk about a variety of things. But sometimes we don't talk about, hey, we feel kind of crappy inside. What's going on here? Not only that, and I'm not trying to put anyone down with this, don't get me wrong, but it's our nature when we come to church and we're around other people, we kind of put our church faces on, if you know what I'm saying. How you doing today? Doing fine. Well, a lot of times we're not doing fine. It could be any variety of issues. But the question is, how do we deal with it? And that's what we're going to be covering these next couple of weeks here. And actually we're going to cover them for the next few weeks, and starting in the first week of February, Randy's going to be preaching for 6 weeks. So you'll get a chance to hear him preach on the life of David. Now, one of the reasons you might be asking yourself is, why have I combined dealing with death and dealing with depression? Aren't they two different subjects? No, I don't think they are. There's one common thread between dealing with each one of them. The common thread is loss. And it doesn't really matter whether you're dealing with the losses of a loved one, as in dealing with death, or whether you're dealing with other losses, it's still the same feelings that you get, the same depression that you get. You can be the loss of status. You can have the loss of money. Relationships are a big one. You know, you have a husband or a wife leave, or a boyfriend or a girlfriend, or any of those things, and you're going to feel bad. You can lose your health. That's another thing where, unfortunately, these flus are only temporary. But some people have to deal with lifelong issues with their health, can lead to depression. Sometimes people get depressed, and they don't even know what they're mourning. But there's some kind of a loss in their life they can't put their finger on, and it brings about depression. I know one of the other things that's a common thing for people to regret is the loss of their youth. They feel like, what have I done with my life? Where have I gotten to? Strangely enough, when I was in my upper 20s and early 30s, I actually started to get rather depressed because I thought to myself, wow, I wasted my life, I haven't accomplished what I wanted, and here I am, life almost over in my 20s and 30s. Yeah, I know, it doesn't make sense now looking back on it. But I had started some businesses, and they ended up failing initially because in some cases I didn't know enough, in other cases I got cheated by people. Not only that, but I didn't bother finishing my college degree because I didn't need it because of what I was doing. There was a number of things that happened, and I was like, what am I going to do with the rest of my life? And you know, it's funny because I look back then, it seemed like I had wasted so much, and yet it was like, I didn't even go back to college till I was 44. So there was a lot of life still left, and hopefully, it's funny, I almost feel like there's more life left now than I felt like there was when I was 20 or 30. But sometimes these feelings of loss can be somewhat irrational. That was an irrational feeling. Anybody could have looked at me and said, you're 25 years old, you're 30 years old, your life's just starting. Didn't matter. My point is this. Whether you have the same fears of loss or the same losses as I do or other losses, the point is it feels real to you. And in some cases it is real also. And we want to deal with what's the biblical way of dealing with this when we have either a death in the family or a death of a close friend, or when we have depression issues that we have to deal with. Now, one of the first things we want to talk about is, how does the world handle death? When we look at the world, there's basically 4 different ways that I've seen that the world handles death. The first way is simply denial, okay? You talk to somebody about their death, they're 25 years old, they're 30 years old, they're in the world, and hey, they're not even going to, what do you mean death? That's never going to happen. It's funny. When you're 18 years old, you think you're immortal usually. It's just the way it works. I thought I was immortal when I was 18. It's not till you get older you start realizing, oh yeah, I might actually die someday. But the point is, it's very easy to just kind of ignore death. Why am I going to deal with death? I don't have to worry about that. The fact is, it could happen at any moment, but the point is, people ignore it. Not only that, but they also not only ignore it, but they have this universalism idea. Oh, well, I'll make it to heaven one way or another. Not going to happen that way. Not only that, the other thing you hear is, basically the theory of eat, drink, and be merry. Don't worry about death. Now, they forget the last part of that verse, which is for tomorrow you die. But the point is that it's really easy to simply deny what's happening as far as death goes and not realizing that. Because basically, people will enter into escapism to get away from dealing with death. Why deal with death if you can go out and you can drink and you can party and you can do whatever you want? You don't have to worry about death. You're going to have fun. Or why deal with death if you can sink yourself into your career? Why deal with death if you can sink yourself into making money or even good things like your family? You pour so much into it, you forget about the fact that, hey, we're mortal. And this is one of the ways the world deals with how to deal with death. And in truth, depression also. Because if people are depressed about things, hey, if you're depressed, just avoid it. The other thing we've got to look at here is when a non-Christian is talking about dealing with death, frequently you hear people talk about, well, we know he went to a better place. We all end up in a better place, okay? I want to read to you, you've probably heard this verse, but Hebrews 9:27, where it says, and inasmuch as it is appointed for men to die once, and after this comes the judgment. Now that's actually goes on to talk about Christ here. But in that section in verse 27, it's showing, look, everybody's going to die. And when you die, you're going to face a judgment. So my point is, one of the ways the world deals with death is simply wishful thinking. Oh, it's all going to turn out all right. Well, if you read the Bible, it's not going to turn out all right. Every single person is either going to go to heaven or hell. Well, technically, lake of fire or New Jerusalem eternally. But the point is, heaven or hell, that's it. There's not going to be any in-between. There's not going to be any purgatory. There's not going to be, oh, well, he was almost good enough. And not only that, nobody's going to be looking at what works you did to get to heaven. One question, are you a believer in Jesus Christ or not? Has he paid the price for your sin? And if you believe that by faith, period. That's it. And this wishful thinking idea is just another way of avoiding what the Bible talks about, where people believe they can get away from it, but they're not really getting away from it. There's no such thing as universalism. And when I say universalism, I mean that everybody ends up saved. No. Some people are going to be in heaven, some people are going to be in hell, and there's no middle ground. And every person in this room, I can't tell you, no matter how well I know you for sure, whether you're going to heaven or hell, only you know and only God knows. But I can tell you this, you're going to one or the other. You're not going to be somewhere in the middle. It's an either-or situation. It's not something where you can be somewhere else. And the world would rather say, we've got this wishful thinking, and the wishful thinking basically is everybody ends up in a better place. No, we don't. Believers in Christ end up in heaven. Those who are outside of Christ end up in hell. But it's another way of avoiding death. One of the other things the world tends to do is just fall into despondency. Some people, when you talk about death, they have no hope. It's just over. That's it, Have you ever met a person who's like 40 years old or 50 years old and they're already shutting down? Their life, they're just they're dreading things so much and afraid of things happening. They're not living anymore. They're just trying to not die, if you know what I'm saying. They're freezing up. It's funny, Linda and I have known a lot of people who've gone into assisted living homes. And if you've been to them in the last 10 or 20 years, you realize, when I was a kid, I had to visit nursing homes. Every Christian kid has to visit a nursing home with somebody or other, okay? Man, it was like walking through a morgue in those places. They were awful places. They really were. And I had that picture in my mind, and all of a sudden we had some friends go into assisted living where it would go right through nursing home. And I went to visit them, and it's like, it's a nice place. I'd move in here. A lot of these places have actually become very nice places now. My point is, the people I've known that move into them tend to fall into two categories. People that light up the entire place when they walk in. They're everybody's friend. They're outgoing. They're not afraid to die. And you got the other people who are afraid to die, and they light up the place when they leave because, they're already in their death progression 20 years before they die, or 5 years, or 10 years, or whatever. But that's another way that people deal with it. And really, that's just going into depression to try to get away from death. And that's not going to solve anything because it's all about loss. The fourth way I see the world tries to handle death, and I've listed it here in the outline as Indian traditions. I mean Indian, not American Indians. And really, it's Indian and Asian. And the reason I bring this up is it's Hinduism. Now, why did I single out Hinduism out of all the world religions? Because what people don't realize is that so many of the religious traditions people follow really have been Hinduism imported into other things. People in the USA follow the New Age movement. They get involved with things like that. They get involved with spiritism. They get involved with certain types of witchcraft. They get involved with other things. They don't realize it, but they're just following Hinduism repackaged for the U.S. And you'll find that in a lot of religions. What's in common with it, number one, reincarnation frequently. Hey, you got a bad life this time, stick it out, you're going to get another one and get another shot at things. Okay? So how do you avoid death? You don't have to worry about it. You're going to get another chance. This is just one of the many deaths you're going to have. Not only that, they all end up with somehow communicating with his great spirit. The goal in Hinduism is literally to leave your body, not reincarnate, and become part of nirvana, this great spirit. All that's doing is avoiding the reality of death and finding another way to say, hey, we can avoid this. The Bible says you can't avoid it. Every one of us is going to die, and then comes the judgment. And we're going to answer for it right then and there. Now, what we've got to look at is we've seen how the world handles this. What makes it different with believers? Why are we different? Well, we've already seen in 1 Thessalonians talking about the resurrection of the dead. The reason we are different comes down to one thing: the resurrection of Jesus Christ and our resurrection because of that. Not because we're better or anything else. But that's the basis for dealing with how we deal with death. And it's also the basis for dealing with how we deal with depression. If you have a loss of something that you feel you've lost in your life, you know something? There is something better coming if you're a believer. You're going to be in heaven, and not only you already have a relationship with God right now. This is the basis of this, and this is what separates us from the world as far as the world's view of death and the world's view of depression. If we look at 1 Thessalonians 4:13, it says, "But we do not want you to be uninformed, brethren, about those who are asleep, that you may not grieve as the rest who have no hope." The context here is that the Thessalonian believers were concerned that some of the Christians were not going to make it to heaven. The ones they were really concerned about were those who died. Because they're like, well, Christ comes back and we're walking around, no problem, he'll just take us with us. But what's Christ do to Bob and Bill and Sally and everybody else who died 5 years ago and now rotting in the grave? Well, Paul's trying to tell them, look, don't worry about that. God hasn't forgotten about that. They're still going to be resurrected. And not only that, but what he's saying to them is about as far as those who have no hope, it's not that you don't mourn the loss, but you'll mourn the loss, but you'll know, hey, there is a hope that we will still see them again and know them and be with them, and they're with Christ now. Now, one of the first things we've got to look at here we're dealing with our basis for how to deal with depression and death. But one of the things we have to look at is this term hope that we see in this verse and we see elsewhere. Because in English, when we hear the word hope, it's like, yeah, I hope I win the lottery next week. Although since I'm not buying tickets, it's going to be difficult. But the point is, I hope good things happen. I hope this. That's in English. That's not what it means in the original here. Excuse me. When we talk about hope here, we're not talking about a wish or a desire. We're talking about an expectation, or we're talking about an assurance. It's something that it doesn't have that same meaning as, gee, I hope it happens, maybe it will, maybe it won't. It's not just wishful thinking. So when he says about having a hope here, those who have hope versus those who have no hope, he's not saying, I hope we make it to heaven. He's saying, you can be assured, a believer is going to go to heaven. It's that simple. And the next question we have here, and I put in the outline, you might wonder, why did I ask this? Is resurrection for all believers? Yes, it is, but why did we ask that? Remember, this first century church in Thessalonica was asking, wait a second, what about those who died already? They were worried that they were going to lose them, and that was it, and that they weren't going to be resurrected. So the point here is, Paul's coming back and saying, every single believer, I don't care if you died or not, every believer is going to be resurrected, and every believer is going to heaven. Now, we also have to look at the reason for our hope. That's the next thing. If you look at verse 14, it says, For if we believe that Jesus died and rose again, excuse me, even so God will bring with him those who have fallen asleep in Jesus. The reason for our hope is only one thing, the resurrection of Jesus Christ. If God didn't resurrect Jesus, we don't have any hope. And again, this is directly related to us dealing with loss, because we have to find out what's our basis to start with before we figure out how to handle this. If you look at 1 Corinthians 15:20, it says, But now Christ has been raised up from the dead, the first fruits of those who are asleep. We see there that Christ has been raised, and secondly, it talks about the first fruits, meaning he's the first one, but he's the first of many. We're going to follow. And we're going to follow because Christ was raised. God has the power to fix anything, and that includes death. So just because somebody dies doesn't mean they're not going to be resurrected. Don't worry about it. Now again, I know there's emotional trauma. But as far as what's going to happen to them, they're going to heaven. If we continue reading in 1 Corinthians, we go back to chapter 15, verse 17 through 18. It says, And if Christ has not been raised, your faith is worthless. You are still in your sins. Then those also who have fallen asleep in Christ have perished. It's simple. If Jesus Christ didn't rise from the grave, there's no reason for you to have any faith, any hope. And that's what we got to look at here again is, the hope is based exclusively on Jesus Christ being raised from the dead. If Jesus Christ wasn't raised from the dead, we can't look at the world and say, hey, you guys, it's just wishful thinking, because you know something? We'd be just wishful thinking too. It's Christ's resurrection that separates our thinking from their thinking. And not only that, Paul also talked about the fact that if Christ didn't raise from the dead, the most pitiful people around are believers, because they're self-deceived and they're getting nothing out of it. The other thing we can see in 2 Corinthians 4:14 is that it is knowing that he who raised the Lord Jesus will raise us also with Jesus and will present us with you. We can see that it's the same God that raised Jesus Christ that's going to raise us. We're going to see the ones that are our loved ones again because it's the same God with the same power and the same abilities. And we're going to be able to live forever with Christ and with God. Actually, I shouldn't. Christ is God, but the whole Trinity I'm talking about there. Now, the next question we've got to ask is, okay, we're different. We've got this hope. We've got the basis for why we shouldn't be depressed. But then we've got, what is the authority for our hope? Now, the reason I bring that up is, let's say you have a contract. If you have a contract with someone, it's only as good as the other person's ability to fulfill that contract. I don't know if you've watched recently, but in the last year or two, it's been interesting to watch the state of Illinois and to watch the bond markets. Illinois has gotten to the point where they flirted with being declared junk bonds by the bond dealers. And they really probably should be declared junk bonds. One of the things that's happening is people who are owed money by the state of Illinois, in some cases, are waiting years to be paid and still aren't getting paid in some cases. One of the things that's happening is, I don't know if you know this or not, Illinois has had lotteries where they win. People pay into the lottery. And you know what they get in the end? They get an IOU. They didn't have money to pay off the lottery winnings. It's happened several times now with Illinois. And they say, well, we'll give you an IOU and we'll pay you over time, and not the schedule they talked about. But can you imagine everybody puts the money into it and then the state says, sorry, we took that. We don't have any money to give you. In addition to that, hospitals were in a situation where the hospitals were starting to have to close in Illinois. You know why? because the state was a year or more behind in their payments to them for what they did. What's even worse is the state came and said, look, state law says you're required to treat these patients. And they were. But then they wouldn't pay the hospitals for it. So what happened is you had hospitals starting to fold, you had all this stuff. It's all because, the reason I bring this up is, Illinois is making contracts, but Illinois has no ability to fulfill those contracts. You're probably going to see it in a couple other states coming up here too in the future. But the point is, a contract is only as good as the ability of the other person to actually fulfill it. You can have a legal remedy to sue somebody, but if they've got nothing, your suit isn't going to do you any good. Point I'm trying to make here is the authority for our hope is God himself. Our resurrection is guaranteed by God. The only way that's going to fail is if God can't do it and God runs out of ability. I'm not real worried about that one. That's what we're talking about here. There is a guarantee. And not only guarantee, if we look at 1 Thessalonians 4:15, it says, "For this we say to you by the word of the Lord, that we who are alive and remain until the coming of the Lord shall not precede those who have fallen asleep." And by the way, when he says asleep, that's simply the polite way of saying died. He's not saying those who are dozing and taking a nap or something. The reason I bring this up is, in addition to God being the guarantor, there's also the word of the Lord, what God has said. Reputation and credibility is everything. Years ago, Linda and I, one of the trips we took was out to Hawaii. And we did a 15-day cruise out of Los Angeles. 5 days out, 5 days at the islands, 5 days back. And we took the Island Princess to do that cruise. Now what's interesting is I believe we were on Kauai, if I remember correctly. We were at one of the islands, the small islands of Hawaii, and a horrible thing happened. If you know how a cruise ship docks and takes off, the captain of the ship typically is not allowed to actually pull it into the port or out of the port. There is a pilot in each port, or pilots in each port, that come out so that they know where every rock is, where every ridge is, where everything is, and they bring the ship in and they take the ship out and then, here, Captain, it's yours. And then what happens is there's a little pilot boat that comes out, pilot gets off, gets onto his boat, they take the pilot back, and that's it. But the reason is because you don't want somebody coming into a port not knowing where the rocks are, for example. So therefore it makes sense. Every normal port has this. The pilot had just taken the ship away from the dock and gone down to his pilot boat. And they were starting to maneuver things. And he got off of his pilot boat with hundreds of people watching over the side, and he slipped. And when he slipped, he fell into the water. And he was immediately sucked into the thrusters on the side of the ship. I didn't actually see it happen, but I talked to a number of people that did. It was a horrifying sight. I'm not even going to describe it to you, okay? But everybody knew instantly, this guy was instantly dead, period. Now, Princess Cruises didn't actually do anything wrong in that. It was the pilot. He slipped. He was in charge of things. He slipped. It was an accident. They did nothing wrong, and all they had to do was just say, hey, sorry, this is a terrible tragedy. We feel sorry for the guy. Everybody would have said, hey, that's a terrible event. But there's something that happened the next day that compounded things. And let me tell you what it was. The captain of the ship got on the intercom and announced that, yes, people saw this happen yesterday, but I want you to know that the pilot just suffered some minor scratches, and he's at home now recovering, and everything's fine. They took him to the hospital a few minutes, they get him out, and he's already at home recovering. Now, while this is going on, I hear two guys in the engine room talking to each other down. They come up from there talking about, man, you see when a guy got killed yesterday? And then they realized people around, so they had to stop talking. And not only that, that ship had internet access. All of us were on the internet. We're already printing out stories about this guy. Yeah, he died. This was his name. He died instantly. They took the remains to the hospital. And here's the captain on the ship saying, everything's cool. The guy's healthy. The guy's walking around, no problems. In addition to that, they told all the employees on the ship they were not allowed to tell anyone the truth. So, for example, Linda and I walked into the gift shop, and it was just us and the employee behind the counter, and we said to the employee, now we know what actually happened, but what really happened, what are you saying happened to the pilot yesterday? And she knew what we were talking about, and she said, I want to tell you that Princess Cruises has instructed me to tell you the pilot's fine. But I'm not saying anything myself. I'm telling you what Princess Cruz has told me to tell you. She's being honest in that. Here's the point. The point is, when you're on a cruise ship in international waters, that captain is the law on the waters, okay? That ship is under international law, and people don't realize if something happens on that ship, it's not like you just phone the police and they come running. The point is this: the moment the captain got on and lied to every person on that ship, he lost all of his credibility. I mean, would you feel comfortable calling this guy in if something serious happened on the ship? Because he is the law on the sea. Everything on that ship went right down the tubes because of credibility. Had he simply said, "Terrible tragedy," nobody would have blamed Princess. Instead, they lied, and they lied deliberately. Now, the reason I bring this up is because by his word, we knew we couldn't trust him. We go back to 1 Thessalonians 4:15, by the word of the Lord. Yeah, that one I'll take. I'm not worried about if God is lying to me. I'm not worried about if God changes his mind. The word of the Lord is what we can trust. He is the guarantor, personally. And not only that, his reputation's on the line. God cannot screw up his reputation. God cannot hurt his own credibility. Unlike people, unlike ship captains. But God is the guarantor, and God's word is the guarantee of this. The other thing we can see from this is for the authority is that alive or dead, Christians are going to rise. It doesn't matter whether you're alive or dead. God has the ability as the guarantor to bring you back from the dead. See, if I said to you, "You're going to rise from the dead because I'm going to bring you back," you'd have reason to worry. Because I don't know how to bring a dead person back. I haven't even tried, to be honest with you. I don't think it's worth trying. When God says it, you can take it to the bank because it's going to happen. And that's what's happening here. And the basis for the reason I'm bringing all this up is the basis for our ability to deal with death and to deal with loss is not about us, it's about God and what he says and God's reputation and God's credibility. Because if we keep that in the back of our minds or in the front of our minds, we're going to be able to deal with these situations. I don't mean to say there's no emotional impact either. We're going to get to that especially next week. But we have to understand the basis of dealing with loss before we go on to talk about it. Now, we talked about the basis here. I want to look at one example of what happened. I want to look at the life of David. Sorry, Randy, this was already in the message. You got 6 weeks on him coming up in February and March. Just a quick synopsis of one incident that happened. We all probably remember that David had Uriah the Hittite murdered to cover up the fact that he had slept with Bathsheba and gotten her pregnant, even though she was the wife of Uriah, and that there was a child that resulted from this. David thought he was off the hook. He had killed the husband. He made it look like the husband was the father. And no, it was not just a battle injury. It was deliberate. Take him up to the front, fall back so that he gets killed. That's called murder. Simple as that. Anyway, David thinks he's off the hook. And all of a sudden, some guy named Nathan walks in. And Nathan's a prophet. And Nathan tells this story about little lambs and everything else. And David is upset and outraged and wants the guy killed. I'm not going to go through the story, but the point is that Nathan then says, "Hey, that's you. You're the one that did this." Well, if you think about it, that was like coming in almost and lecturing the president of the U.S. or something, except for one difference. David could have instantly said, "Nathan, you're dead." Had him killed right there. Nathan was taking his life in his hands when he did this, but he still went in and told David, "David, you are wrong. And not only are you wrong, but there's going to be consequences." If we read 2 Samuel 12:14, it says, "However, because by this deed you have given occasion to the enemies of the Lord to blaspheme, so the child also that is born to you shall surely die." David, because of your sin, this kid's going to die. It's that simple. It is not what David wanted to hear. I do know this. I do know that when my father died and my sister died both, in both cases, before the end, the doctors came to us and said, "They're not going to make it." It was not what we wanted to hear. As bad as that is, we weren't going to have the doctor killed for saying it. Nathan could have been killed by David, and yet he still told him that. It's not what David wanted to hear, but he said, God's going to do this. And this death was specifically for God's judgment on what happened. Now, if we read 15 through 18, continuing on to 2 Samuel 12. So Nathan went to his house. Then the Lord struck the child that Uriah's widow bore to David, so that he was very sick. David therefore inquired of God for the child, and David fasted and went to lay all night on the ground. The elders of his household stood beside him in order to raise him up from the ground, but he was unwilling and would not eat food with them. Then it happened on the 7th day that the child died, and the servants of David were afraid to tell him that the child was dead, for they said, Behold, while the child was still alive, we spoke to him, and he did not listen to our voice. How can we then tell him that this child is dead, since he might do something to himself? The first thing we want to see in these verses before we even get to David's reaction is I find something very interesting. And I find it a real condemnation of what David did. Do you notice it says, Then the Lord struck the child that Uriah's widow bore to David. It doesn't say that Bathsheba bore to David. It says Uriah's widow. It was pointing it out. This woman was not yours in the first place. You murdered her husband, and then right after you got her pregnant, and just pointing out to David, this is the reason for the judgment, right here. Now, in addition to that, it starts talking about David would not eat or arise, and he laid on the ground. And this appears to have gone on for 7 days. The one thing I think we can say from that is he was depressed. He wasn't saying, oh great, at this point I'll see this kid again, and therefore I don't have to worry about it and I don't have any emotions. No, he was depressed. He was experiencing loss. And he should have been depressed in this case. But when the child got sick, he not only was depressed, but he also sought God. He was pleading to God, please God, let this kid live. He did at least recognize that only God could solve the problem. And he tried to fix it by seeking God. But it didn't work. And does this kind of remind you of something? Almost a lot of people, you hear it when they're going to have a relative die or something like that, or even a financial catastrophe or whatever the depression is going to be, they want to make a deal with God. It's not the time to make a deal with God, because the fact is our lives should already be a testament to God and what we're doing. When David came to God and wanted to make a deal with him, it didn't hold any water because he was already under God's judgment for what he had done. We can see also in like we read verse 18, he was not only depressed and upset, he was so depressed, and this is normal. He was so depressed, they said, how can we possibly tell him this child has died? When they said he might do something to himself, they're worried he might kill himself. They're worried he would hurt himself. So this is a level of distress that David's in and depression that goes far beyond just normal, oh, I'm a little upset. And during this whole time also, he was fasting and weeping. When we continue on in this, we see in verse 19, we see the child actually died in verse 18. We read that. If you look at verse 19 on, we see, but when David saw that his servants were whispering together, David perceived that the child was dead. So David said to his servants, is the child dead? And they said, he is dead. So David arose from the ground, washed, anointed himself, and changed his clothes, and he came into the house of the Lord and worshipped. And then he came to his own house, and when he requested, they set food before him, and he ate. Does that sound a little weird? He's so bad off they think he's going to kill himself. He's laying on the ground. He refuses to eat for a week. They tell him the kid's dead, and suddenly, okay, let's go worship God. Let's go eat. It's not that he's not upset. It's the fact that when he died, he realized it's a done deal. It's not going to change. In addition to that, when we look back at the child dying, there is no more chance to avoid a loss at that point in time. The loss is done. You can't change it. Sin has consequences, and that's what David was realizing there and learning. But he could also see, when you're done with it, move on. Now, one thing I want to say about sin having consequences, this was a special circumstances. And this was direct judgment from God. I don't want to leave you with the impression that automatically if you have a child out of wedlock or sleep with somebody's wife and have a child, suddenly that child's going to have the consequences of God's judgment on them. Now, the reason I say that is I've actually run into people for various things, either they weren't married when they had the child or whatever, and they really have believed that that child's always going to be cursed. Well, that's not true. That's something they're making up in their own head. This was a specific situation where God was going to be blasphemed among the heathen because of what David did. And that's why the judgment arose. Okay? Now also, sometimes when we look at why do bad things happen, okay? In this case, it was divine judgment. In some cases, it just happens because we're in the world and it's a sinful world. In other cases, you have people that bring it on themselves. I mean, honestly, I've dealt with people sometimes that are like, I don't know why I can't get ahead. Well, did you graduate from high school? No. Did you get somebody pregnant when you were a teenager? Yeah. And you go on and on. All right, you're 20 years older now. Have you gone back and learned how to do the stuff you would have learned in high school? Did you get your GED? I've spoken to people literally that were smart enough to get their GEDs and said, look, all you got to do is take 3 exams. You got your high school diploma. And they never did it. They just go on and on about why they can't succeed. The point is that in order to succeed, at least in those cases, there is some things they can do on their own to pull themselves out of what they're in. My point being is there's different reasons for bad things happening. Sometimes it's us, sometimes it's sin in the world. In this case, it is a different situation. It's specifically judgment from God. But too often we look at things and we want to say it's God's judgment, and it's not God's judgment. We've either brought it on ourselves or it's just the normal sinful world. Now, again, we go back to this with David worshiping at this point in time. David couldn't change the situation, and he knew dwelling on it would not help. If we dwell on the fact of the loss, we're going to get depressed. If we dwell on what God can do, it will bring us out of that depression. And I don't mean automatically either, but it will bring us out of it. If we look at David's reaction in verse 23, it said, "But now he has died, why should I fast? Can I bring him back again? I will go to him, but he will not return to me." David realized there's nothing he could do anymore. When my sister died, it was a very strange situation. I've told you before about this, where 5.5 weeks in the hospital before she died in intensive care, where it was totally unexpected and out of the blue when she got sick, and it was a very rare disease. One thing that people didn't really quite understand is she died it was a Friday, mid-afternoon on a Friday. And I was the one at the hospital when it happened. And basically what we did was we called all of her close friends up, and a bunch of her close friends came over to my parents' house, and I grabbed a stack of pizzas on the way back, and we had a pizza party that night. Did it fix everything? No. But it allowed all of us to not only remember her, but to remember the fact that there was no question she was in heaven now. It actually was a way to celebrate her life that she had instead of just mourning on her death. Did that take all the pain away? No, it didn't. But it was a way to focus on what God had done as opposed to focusing on the loss we were experiencing. Now, one thing I want to say here, David's example we're giving about this sudden turnaround, and even with what I said about my sister with the pizzas, that's an ideal situation. That can be misleading. Because sometimes we almost feel like, well, gee, if we can't just overcome this by being faithful enough, we got a problem. Well, that's not true. David was depressed and desperate in this situation. I mean, look at him. 7 days without eating. But yet one of those lies we hear sometimes is, you wouldn't be depressed if you were just spiritual enough, if you just focused enough on God. We have to look at these things we've looked at today for the basis of why we can overcome depression and why we can overcome death. But it doesn't instantly take it away. Why? Because God created us as humans with emotions and feelings. That's the way we're designed to be. If you lose somebody close to you, or have a financial catastrophe or whatever, and you're just going along like, yeah, who cares, no big deal, okay? That doesn't mean that you're being spiritual. It means you're probably a sociopath. That's not normal. It means you don't have the normal empathy that a person would have. So what I'm saying is, while we have to focus on the basis for God being the source of how we're going to get through this, we also have to realize it's not like a magic slogan we say or something like that, and suddenly it's over. Next week when we continue this, the first thing we're going to hit is the false views of how to deal with situations like this. Because now, as I said, one of them that we have is, if you were just spiritual enough. And let me tell you that what we're going to talk about next week, one of the dangers I've seen with that, and I've really seen this, I've seen believers try to lecture other believers who have experienced great loss and come to them right away and tell them, you know, you shouldn't be depressed. The problem is you're not spiritual enough. That's not true. And I've also seen people turn it on themselves and feel terrible, because it's like, if I were just spiritual enough, you know, I wouldn't be depressed. Those are some of the false views we're going to look at next week. Again, this is too big for one message. We're going to go ahead and close now. And in addition to that, just to let you know, we're not going to do a final hymn, because due to children's church, due to illnesses, due to everything, we're down 3 pianists so far. So we're going to go ahead and I'll dismiss you from up here. But we're going to go ahead and pray, and then you'll be dismissed. And please feel free to shake hands but not infect each other.